Well, welcome to this talk on being a change maker, how you can make a difference. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story, and I hope that it might inspire you to create your own story. So it all began for me way back in 1967, when I was 15 years old and still at school. That's when I first began campaigning. Nothing prepared me to do that because I came from a very conservative working class family. None of my family members, not my parents or brother or sisters, none of my schoolmates were in any way interested in human rights or social activism. But somehow I came to it. And I would identify the moment as 1963, when I was 11 years old. I heard about the bombing of a black church in Birmingham, Alabama, in the United States, where 4 young girls about my own age were murdered by white racists. I can remember, as an 11-year-old, thinking to myself, how could anyone kill another human being, let alone 4 young girls in church on Sunday morning? And that prompted my interest in and support for the black civil rights movement in the United States. I was inspired and motivated by their ideals and courage. So what I did was I adapted the way they worked to the issues that concerned me. And one of the issues was at school. You know, we didn't have a very democratic school despite living in a democratic society. So we petitioned and campaigned to set up a students' representative council where every form in the school would elect a delegate who would sit on the students' representative council, which would have regular meetings with the headmaster and staff, and we proposed changes in school policy. So that was probably the first thing I did, although it wasn't a traditional human rights campaign. But the really serious first campaign I did was in 1967, when I was 15. And that was the occasion of the execution of Ronald Ryan in my hometown of Melbourne, Australia. He was hanged by the neck for allegedly shooting dead a prison warder during a jail escape. But I read a summary of the autopsy report on the dead warder's body. And I worked out that from where the prison escapee, Ronald Ryan, was standing when he allegedly fired the fatal shot, and where the prison warder was standing when he was shot down, the trajectory of the bullet didn't match those locations. The bullet would have had to do a semi-U-turn in midair to have caused the injuries to that prison warder. Now, I'm not saying, and I didn't believe at the time, whether or not Ronald Ryan was guilty, but I certainly thought there was some doubt about the safety of his conviction. So I joined with protests to try and stop him being hanged. We failed. He was hanged anyway. And that provoked my lifetime skepticism of authority. I began to question lots of things that I either never thought about or I just took for granted. So one early campaign that soon followed was to champion the civil and land rights of Indigenous black Australians, the Aboriginal peoples who have been dispossessed on their own lands by white English settlers from the late 1770s onwards. When the first white settlers arrived in Australia, there were somewhere between 500,000 and 750,000 Indigenous black Australians. By the 1920s, that number had been cut to not much more than 100,000. A massive depopulation. caused by a combination of Western diseases introduced to the indigenous population for which they had no immunity, and by a policy of forcing them off their land, off fertile hunting grounds and fishing grounds, and pushing them into remote semi and desert regions. That was a quasi-genocide. I never learnt about that at school. But when I learnt about it, it motivated me to campaign to support the Aboriginal people's struggle. Another big early campaign was against Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. Australia, alongside American troops, was propping up a far-right dictatorship in the south of Vietnam and engaging in acts that were effectively war crimes, like the mass, indiscriminate aerial bombardment of parts of Vietnam that were deemed to be sympathetic to the communists. Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of civilians were being killed. So I got involved in the campaign to stop Australia's involvement. And with others, I organised a Vietnam Moratorium campaign, a campaign to stop Australia's involvement in Vietnam. We organised what was a de facto general strike in Melbourne in 1970 under the slogan of "Stop work to stop the war." We called on people, whatever you're doing, stop work, join this protest in the centre of Melbourne to show the government this war has got to end. And in 1970, at a time when Melbourne only had a population of about 1 million people, nearly 100,000 people turned out and brought the centre of the city to a standstill. Almost 10% of the population. And that was a turning point. The government realised that it had lost public support. And in the following 2 or 3 years, eventually Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War was ended. It wasn't until 1969, when I was 17 years old, that I realised I was gay. I had been at school and I was very left-wing, very championing very many unpopular causes, and many other people suspected I was gay. Nevertheless, in 1968, my last year at school, I was voted as school captain by all the pupils in the school. So I became the spokesperson for the pupils in the school, despite my quite radical ideas and despite many pupils thinking I was gay. And this was at a time when in Melbourne, in the state of Victoria, Australia, homosexuality was still a very serious criminal offence. You could potentially be imprisoned for several years, and even there was the prospect of being forced to undergo psychiatric treatment to cure your homosexuality. So it was quite a big deal that I was elected as a school captain. From that time onwards, I only had a year in that role because the next year I was forced to leave school at 16, the minimum age, because my parents were very poor and they needed me to go out to work to help support the family financially. So I had a great passion for art and design, but obviously I had no qualifications. So a friend recommended, why don't you go and work in a department store? They have big design and display departments. You could be an apprentice there. So I signed up and got a job with one of the biggest department stores in Melbourne, working on designing and making windows, interiors, sign writing, and other things like that. So that was my first job. But on the side, I was doing all this campaigning on Aboriginal Indigenous rights, on campaign against the Vietnam War, and when I realised I was gay, for LGBT+ rights. But in Melbourne at the time, there were no LGBT+ organisations. There was no campaign group, there were no counselling services, no switchboards, no helplines, nothing. So over time I managed to meet other gay people, and I proposed the idea of setting up a gay rights organisation. I'd never heard about the Stonewall Uprising in New York in 1969, but about 2 months later, I did hear about a subsequent LGBT liberation protest in New York. It was reported as a little news in brief in one of the local papers. I can remember when I saw that, I thought, wow, I want to be part of that. But as I said, I had very few gay friends, and when I proposed setting up an organization, they were all terrified. They said, what do you know? You're only 17 years old, you'll get us all arrested, go away. So all I could do initially was just write letters to the press, urging the decriminalization of homosexuality and proposing or urging an end to police harassment, because police were witch hunting gay people at that time. Initially, I was too scared to sign my name, let alone give my address, because I feared that the newspaper might hand over my letter to the police and I and my then boyfriend would be arrested. So the letters were originally anonymous. Then over time I plucked up the courage to sign my name, and even a bit later on to actually give my address. There was no knock by the policeman at my door, but I was always on tenterhooks that there might be. It wasn't until I came to London in 1971 at the age of 19 that I was able to, for the first time, get involved in LGBT plus campaigning. Within 5 days of arriving in London, I was at my first meeting of the newly formed Gay Liberation Front. And within a month, I was helping to organize many of its spectacular protests against police harassment, against media demonization and victimization of LGBT plus people, against psychiatric abuses like aversion therapy, which was a therapy whereby gay people were given electric shocks to try and make them straight. They were shown images of same-sex couples and then given electric shocks. And the theory behind this was like Pavlov's dog, you know, the behaviorism of Skinner and others, that if you showed a gay person an image of gay sexuality or a handsome man, then they would become averse and be repelled by homosexuality. It didn't work, but that was being done in Britain at public expense on the National Health Service until the early to mid 1970s. And I had a friend who underwent it, and it didn't cure him, but it just made him impotent and unable to form any attachments with other men. So from that moment onwards, I was doing both LGBT plus human rights campaigning and other human rights campaigning as well. Because to me, LGBT plus rights is just one part of the spectrum of human rights. And I believe in human rights for everyone. So I want to just talk you through some of the campaigns I've done. I think some of you may have seen the new Netflix documentary about my 54 years of campaigning. It's called Hating Peter Tatchell. If you haven't seen it, look it up on Netflix. It gives a good flavor of the kinds of campaigns I've done over the last 5 decades and so. The reason I collaborated with making that film, and it was made totally independently by someone else, it wasn't my film, it was their interpretation, but the reason I collaborated was because I wanted to show to a wider audience that social change is possible and to give examples of how you can do it. And my hope was that I would inspire future generations like yourselves to also become change makers. So, looking at the different campaigns I've done, I'll just give you a snapshot of a few of them. Way back in the 1990s, George Carey was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. And he was on record as saying that homosexual people are inferior to heterosexual people, and therefore the law should, in certain circumstances, discriminate. That LGBT plus people, because of our moral and other inferiorities, we were not deserving of equal human rights. We tried to have a dialogue with the Archbishop, but he wouldn't meet us. So together with other members of the LGBT plus direct action group Outrage, I went to Canterbury Cathedral on Easter Sunday in 1998 to call out the Archbishop. Now, we arrived early on that morning, knowing that the service was going to be televised around the world. So this for us was a great opportunity to tell the world what the Archbishop was doing and saying, and to appeal for him to stop colluding with the persecution of LGBT plus people. Of course, we would have loved to have met him at Lambeth Palace over a cup of tea and got his agreement to stop his support for discrimination. But as I said, we wrote to him and got no replies. So we sat very quietly in our Sunday best in a side aisle of the cathedral. We didn't interrupt any sacred parts of the service. We waited until the Archbishop began his main sermon, his political treatise, which was about, among other things, Northern Ireland, the situation there. And then we calmly got up out of our seats and walked towards the front of the cathedral to the pulpit. Now, as we proceeded forward, we noticed there were 3 church wardens standing by the pulpit. And obviously, as a non-violent group, we did not want to have any altercation with them. So one of our members had the brilliant idea on the spot of feigning an asthma attack. And he fell down clutching his heart. And the good, kindly wardens rushed over to help him. Meanwhile, the rest of us just walked up into the pulpit. I remember walking up, standing next to the Archbishop. He looked at me in shock and amazement, then stood to one side and gave me the pulpit. And I began to preach an alternative sermon, which was basically, discrimination is not a Christian value. Now, because Easter Sunday and is such a big civic event, and as they televised around the world, in the front rows of the cathedral were, among others, the chief constable and his senior police officers. So they got up out of their seats and then came around into the pulpit to remove and arrest us. Initially, there was quite a conflagration, not between, well, with us, but the warders were in the way, and the police had to get the warders out of the way. But then each of my colleagues was removed. I was very, very nervous, speaking to this worldwide audience, and I held on to the front of this beautiful ancient pulpit with my hands to steady myself, to steady my nerves. The next thing I know, some big hefty arms grabbed me around the waist and yanked me backwards. And because it was unexpected and I was holding on to the pulpit, part of this beautiful ancient medieval pulpit came away in my hands. I was horrified. Anyway, I was taken off and taken to Canterbury Police Station, where I spent the next nearly 7 hours while the police decided what to charge me with. They didn't know what the charge could be. I hadn't insulted anybody. I hadn't been abusive. I was perfectly polite and peaceful. So I was bailed eventually, and then some weeks later told I was going to be charged with, quote, indecent behavior in a church. I hasten to add, I did not drop my trousers, but under the Ecclesiastical Courts Jurisdiction Act of 1860, formerly part of the Brawling Act of 1551, anybody who interrupts a minister of religion in a church is deemed to have behaved indecently. So I was arraigned for trial, and on trial, the magistrate accepted that it had been a brief, peaceful protest, that I hadn't threatened or insulted the Archbishop or the Christian religion, that I had been very, very polite and well behaved. But he said, there are no exceptions to this law. There are no exclusions, no exemptions. I have to find you guilty. Now, I think he could have fined me, up to £5,000 and sent me to prison for several months. But he gave me a sentence of £18.60, his reference to the 1860 Act under which I've been charged. So that was my first, and to this day only, standing conviction, out of over 3,000 protests and over 100 arrests. That's the only one conviction that has been sustained. Another example, which you may have heard of, was my various attempts to arrest, excuse me, another protest you may have heard of has been my various attempts to arrest President Mugabe of Zimbabwe on charges of human rights abuses, but most notably torture. President Mugabe was a liberation hero. He helped end white minority rule in what was then called Rhodesia, which meant that black people were not allowed to vote, and there was widespread institutional discrimination against black Zimbabweans. Robert Mugabe led a liberation struggle which ended that system of quasi-apartheid and discrimination, and a very good thing that was. But over time, he became more and more determined to remain in power. So he began to crack down on the opposition. In the 1980s, it's estimated that he ordered the massacre up to 20,000 black Africans in the Matabele and Midland regions of Zimbabwe. Opposition supporters who supported a rival political party. At the time, the world was just looking the other way. There was silence. So sometime later, as his tyranny became worse and worse, I was asked by Zimbabwean activists to do something to try and highlight Mugabe's abuses. And so I hit on the idea of using the power of citizen's arrest. Under British law and the law of most countries, a private citizen has the right to arrest someone if they have evidence that that person has committed a crime or is about to commit a crime. So I had evidence from Amnesty International that President Mugabe had authorized the torture of 2 black journalists in Zimbabwe, Ray Choto and Mark Chabanduka. So there was a clear legal case for his arrest. The question was when and how to try and arrest him. Of course, I urged governments to arrest him. You know, when he traveled abroad, I urged governments, arrest this man, here's the evidence, he's committed a crime under international human rights law. But no government was willing to do it. So that's why the power of citizen's arrest was something I decided to use. I wasn't particularly hopeful I would succeed, but I thought at least in attempting, it would highlight the failures of governments and it would draw attention to the human rights abuses in Zimbabwe. So I waited for months, and then in late October 1999, I received a phone call, an anonymous phone call about midnight. A man with a very thick African accent said, "You may be interested to know that President Mugabe has arrived in London. He's here for a Christmas shopping trip at Harrods. He's staying at the St James's Court Hotel near Victoria, and he's flying back to Zimbabwe on Saturday night." Before I could ask any questions, the caller hung up. I thought to myself, is this a wind-up, a hoax, a joke? I decided to go with the hunch that it might be true. So the next day, I went and got all the legal evidence that Mugabe had committed torture from Amnesty International. And then I started phoning around other organizations to ask if they would get people to come and try and arrest him at his hotel. I've never heard so many quasi-plausible excuses in my life. But no one was willing. So I turned to my colleagues in the LGBT plus activist group Outrage. You know, we had a history of doing pretty daring, radical things. And although this was not a gay issue, you know, Mugabe was homophobic, but we were trying to get him under international law on charges of torture. So it wasn't a gay issue, but my colleagues recognised that we stand for universal human rights. So of course we should support Zimbabwean victims of torture. So eventually 3 other members of Outrage agreed to come and try and arrest him. So we agreed to lay in wait outside his hotel from early in the morning on Saturday, because I'd been told that he was going to fly back to Zimbabwe at 6 p.m. that day. So at some point he would have to leave his hotel. Then we would try to arrest him. So we tried to look inconspicuous. One guy stood in a telephone box pretending to make phone calls. Another one stood by a bus stop. Another one read a newspaper. I was looking in shop windows. But after 2.5 hours, or 2 hours, we were there from 8:30 in the morning, and by 10:30, still no sign of Mugabe. But what we did see was the concierge of the hotel, the guy with the top hat and tails, because it was a very fancy hotel, came and stood on the steps and began looking at us. And I thought, oops, if he's suspicious, maybe he'll call the police. Then the next thing I know, a while later, out from the side entrance came 4 or 5 African-looking guys who started looking and pointing at us. Firstly, my heart soared, thinking, who could these African-looking guys be? Maybe President Mugabe is in the hotel, and maybe they are his security detail. Then my heart sank and thought, if they are his bodyguards, if they're suspicious, they'll call the police, we'll be arrested, and the whole plan will fall to pieces. So in those circumstances, it's very, very hard to think clearly and to be spontaneous. I was so nervous. My body temperature had dropped. I was shivering and shaking. I had goosebumps all over, even though I was dressed very well, with lots of clothes. My stomach was churning over. I had a splitting headache from the nervous tension. But somehow I had a brainwave. I walked over to those guys, smiling and beaming, and holding out my hand as if to greet them. I said, "Hi guys, I'm from the News of the World. We've heard that Elton John is in the hotel with his new boyfriend. We've got to get some photographs and stories for tomorrow's paper. Can you please help us? Which room is he in?" And they looked at me like I was a crazy man. So I then said, "Look, I'll give you £50 if you tell us which room he's in." They shook their heads. "I'll give you £75. I'll give you £100. I only had £10 in my pocket. Still, they weren't buying it. So then I turned to one of them and said, "You can't fool me. I know Elton John's in this hotel because you are part of his security details. I saw you at Elton's Wembley concert 2 months ago." There was no Elton concert 2 months previous. Anyway, they fell for it. They all burst out laughing and walked away. And I walked away thinking, I think I might have convinced them. And I was pretty certain by this stage that they must be there for some VIP, and who else could it be but President Mugabe? Sure enough, 10 minutes later, out comes President Mugabe in his limousine. I scratched the top of my head to indicate it's him in the car, and my colleagues further up the street run in front, forcing it to halt so it can't move forward, and then one ran behind so it couldn't move backwards, so it was stuck with people on either side. I ran from the side, opened the rear car door. Amazingly, it was unlocked, and there in front of me was President Mugabe. I leaned into the car. I took his arm with this hand and held up my other hand with an open palm to show I didn't have a weapon. You should have seen the look on his face. He is very dark-skinned, but a visible ashen pallor came across his face. His eyes popped, his jaw dropped. I think he thought he was going to be killed. And I thought in my own mind, now you know what your victims feel like, only we're not going to kill you. You'll have a chance to defend yourself in a court of law. Then we summons the police. Initially, only 3 officers arrived, and there were 4 of us. So it took 2 officers to remove us from the car and put us on the pavement. But as soon as we were put on the pavement, the person on the pavement ran back in front of the car. It wasn't until about 20 reinforcements arrived that they managed to successfully remove us. We were taken to Belgravia police station, where we spent nearly 7 hours in the cells. Meanwhile, President Mugabe was given a police escort to go Christmas shopping at Harrods. We did not succeed, but we brought with us camera crews, video person, photographer, and a journalist. And they wrote up the story and put it out all over the world. So it got worldwide media coverage, raising awareness about the human rights abuses in Zimbabwe. In the weeks afterwards, I probably received about 5,000 emails and other messages from people inside Zimbabwe. They all said the same thing. We thought no one knew, we thought no one cared. So it was a big morale boost for people in Zimbabwe to know that there were people on the other side of the world who cared about what was happening in their country and who'd help shine a spotlight on the human rights abuses. Sadly, President Mugabe remained in power for quite a few more years, but eventually his terror campaign did somewhat reduce. I wouldn't say that was down to us. It was down to the struggle of the Zimbabwean people. But we're glad to have done something to support them. So I think I'll finish there, and if we've got time, we'll have a few questions and answers. But thank you.